The wooden bench trembled under me when the bailiff set a thick envelope on the judge's desk, and one of my sons muttered, "Just read it already." The air felt colder near them, as if their impatience could lower the temperature. I watched their faces without letting mine crack. I should have broken down right then, but instead I gave a small, steady smile that tasted like grit. I didn't know whether the list inside that envelope would save me or devastate me, only that it would change something I had held for years. I felt the question rising in me like breath. What will survive this moment? I used that question to ground myself. Not the courtroom's edges, not the harsh overhead lights, not even the sound of their shoes tapping. My children, grown and restless, just the pulse inside my own wrist. I kept my hand on the armrest, almost still, feeling the faint warmth there. It reminded me of mornings in my kitchen long before lawyers and motions existed between us, mornings when I'd lean against the counter and listen to their voices echoing from the hallway. Back then, I never imagined those echoes fading or returning twisted. I suppose no mother does. Today, though, I sat facing the truth of how far love can drift when ambition and resentment tug at it. I listened to their whispers behind me without turning. The sting was real, but the dignity had to be louder. I folded a breath inward and waited for the judge's cue, pretending it was just another waiting room, another ordinary hour in a life I once controlled. I wasn't sure when things first began to shift. Maybe on a late afternoon when I left work drained and found bills spread across my dining table, bills I didn't remember giving them permission to sort through. Maybe in the way they started addressing me, not by my name or as their mother, but by what I owned or owed. But this courtroom, this heavy silence, didn't appear out of nowhere. It rose from months of clipped conversations and strained dinners, from glances that carried more calculation than affection. A part of me had known something was coming. I just hadn't expected them to take it this far, nor that my own resolve would carry me through the door without trembling. I had prepared for this hearing with a kind of quiet ritual each morning. Coffee alone, a slow walk around my small porch, a promise whispered only to myself. Do not meet hostility with noise, meet it with truth. Yet sitting there, I could feel how much the truth weighed. The judge looked at the bailiff as if ready to open a wound nobody could close again. My attorney, seated to my right, leaned slightly toward me, not touching, only reminding me with his presence that I did not come here unprotected. He had told me that keeping calm would be our greatest advantage. Calm was never the problem. It was the ache beneath it I had to keep from rising too fast. I straightened my back when the judge asked whether all parties were ready to proceed. My children responded first, too quickly, as if they were afraid hesitation might cost them something. I answered last, my voice steady, warm with a sadness I didn't bother to hide. The truth was that everything I had built, every possession they now contested, had been paid for with long days, quiet weekends, and years spent holding a home together even as its foundations were shifting. But I knew better than to tell that story here. A courtroom is no place for nostalgia. It demands clarity, not emotion. Still, emotion leaked through the cracks, settling in the spaces between each line spoken. When the judge gestured for the bailiff to begin, my children leaned forward. I kept my eyes soft. Whatever was written on that list, every item they believed belonged to them, everything I had cared for in ways they had forgotten, was no longer the heart of the conflict. The real loss had already happened long before we stepped into this building. The real loss was trust, and strangely, knowing that softened the fear. As the envelope was opened with a crisp tear, I felt the courtroom hold its breath. My fingers curled gently against my palm, but no one noticed. They were too focused on the promise of ownership, the idea that taking would fill something inside them. I thought of the day each child was born, how I had once believed I existed to shelter them, not to defend myself from them. That memory rose like a tide, a soft reminder that love doesn't erase itself. Even here, even now, it was alive inside me, refusing to turn bitter. That was my quiet rebellion. The bailiff adjusted the papers, ready to speak. The sound of the sheets settling echoed faintly across the polished floor. I exhaled slowly, gathering my composure with the same care I used to gather stray ribbons or broken toys they left scattered when they were small. I didn't know what would come next. I only knew I would meet it with the same steady backbone I had carried through every hardship before. Calm, present, unshaken. I stepped out of the courtroom into the hallway's muted light, letting the door hush closed behind me. My attorney suggested a short break before we resumed, and I nodded, though my legs felt heavier than they should have. The hallway smelled faintly of old paper and floor polish, the kind of scent that collects in places where people come to argue over the past. I walked slowly toward the end of the corridor, following a narrow strip of sunlight that fell through a high window. The warmth on my wrist steadied me again. My children were somewhere behind me, voices rising and fading, but I didn't turn. I'd spent enough of my life turning when they called. I stopped near a bench and lowered myself onto it, keeping my posture long and calm. A small hum vibrated in the walls. Maybe an air vent, maybe the building settling. I closed my eyes for just a moment, letting the sound carry me back to an early afternoon months before all this began, when the first small crack had appeared. It had been a quiet day, one of those deceptively peaceful ones when the sky over my street looked too blue to predict any storm. I had returned from work, a little weary but carrying fresh groceries and the hope of a simple evening. Inside my home, I found two of my children at the dining table, heads bent over my documents, bank statements, insurance papers, even receipts I hadn't touched in years. They didn't look up immediately. When they finally did, their expressions were not guilty or startled. They were assessing. I remember setting the grocery bag down slowly, the apples rolling until one brushed against my elbow. I had asked what they were doing. They answered with a casualness that didn't match the scene, saying they were trying to help me get things organized. Help, though, is usually offered with softness. This felt more like a review. They spoke about my belongings as if they were already dividing them, speaking in terms of what made sense, what should go where, who needed what. At one point, one of them asked if I had ever considered downsizing, maybe handing off certain assets early so things wouldn't get complicated later. Later. That word had hung in the air like a sudden chill. I hadn't reacted much then. I remember choosing stillness over confrontation. I had listened, gently redirected, and eventually walked to the kitchen to put the groceries away. But something inside me had shifted, just a small tilt, the kind you only recognize in hindsight. I didn't know whether to be hurt or puzzled, so I settled on neither. I told myself they were stressed or misinformed or trying too hard to prove they were grown. But even as I tried to soften it for myself, I felt a new distance forming. Now, in this courthouse hallway, that memory returned with sharper edges. I opened my eyes and let the sunlight fall across my hands. My attorney approached quietly, sitting beside me without touching the bench's railing. He asked if I needed water. I said no, but thanked him. He studied my expression for a moment, then spoke in that measured tone he relied on. "The judge is attentive," he said. "That's good for us. The list will speak louder than anyone in that room." I nodded, absorbing his words. The list. I still didn't know everything written on it, though I had supplied documents and explanations for weeks. What I didn't know was the order, the framing, the way the truth would land once spoken aloud. I felt strangely calm about that. Sometimes the truth only needs air to rearrange a room. Behind us, the courtroom door opened, my children stepping out for their own break. Their voices reached us, tight, frustrated, almost angry with each other. I kept my gaze forward, smoothing the crease of my skirt with one slow gesture. I didn't need to hear details. Family fractures rarely stay contained. They echo through tone before they echo through words. My attorney leaned closer, his voice low. "This is the moment just before the tide shifts. Stay steady. Steady. Yes, that I could do." I rose from the bench, letting the last of the sunlight fall away as I walked back toward the courtroom door. My children noticed me, but didn't greet me. Their silence didn't pierce the way it once had. I understood something now. Distance isn't always a wound. Sometimes it is space earned. When the bailiff called us back in, I inhaled once, deeply, letting the air settle into my ribs. I returned to my seat, the envelope already opened on the judge's desk, pages arranged in careful stacks. The bailiff stood poised, ready to continue. For a moment, everything felt suspended, the kind of pause that happens right before a truth becomes undeniable. I folded my hands gently, my palms warm again. Whatever came next, I would meet it without flinching. The bailiff's voice hadn't yet resumed, but the atmosphere inside the courtroom had changed. It felt tighter somehow, as if every beam in the ceiling leaned in to listen. I sat with my hands resting lightly on my lap, fingertips touching. Not clasped, not tense, just aligned. My attorney whispered that this next portion would outline the background of the dispute, and I nodded, letting my gaze drift to a distant spot near the judge's bench. I didn't want my children to see me watching them. Distance, again, was the small mercy I offered myself. But my mind didn't stay in the room for long. It wandered to those early evenings when the rhythm of my life still felt certain. I could almost smell the faint citrus from my kitchen cleaner and hear the soft hum of the old refrigerator I'd owned for years. I cooked simple meals, nothing grand. Roasted vegetables, rice, chicken seasoned and slow. But the quiet of those evenings had felt like safety. After long shifts, I'd slip my shoes off near the door, welcome the hush, and sit by the window with a glass of water, looking at the yard as twilight settled. There was comfort in those small rituals. Comfort in knowing I had built a home that stood steady, even when I did not. That steadiness came at a cost. I worked long hours, sometimes taking on extra tasks because the mortgage didn't care how tired I was. My hands often ached by nightfall, and some mornings I rose before dawn just to keep pace. I told myself it was temporary, that one day the burden would ease, that my children would appreciate the foundation being laid for them. And for a long time, they did. They'd run through the house with the kind of uncontained joy that makes fatigue worth bearing. They'd leave school projects scattered on the couch, trusted me with secrets whispered against my shoulder. I carried all of it, their laughter, their needs, their fears, with wholehearted devotion. But families don't break in a single day. They stretch, thin out, pull in uneven directions until the fabric starts to fray in quiet places. It began with small requests. Can you cover this? Could you sign here? Do you think you could help one more time? I always said yes, maybe out of habit, maybe out of guilt, maybe because saying no felt like dropping something precious. Each yes cost me something I didn't immediately notice. A little time, a little savings, a little self. I remembered a late night when one of my children called, asking for financial help again. I sat at the foot of my bed, rubbing the bridge of my nose, and said I'd think about it. The silence on the other end told me the answer wasn't good enough. When I finally declined, gently but firmly, there was a shift, a sigh edged with disappointment, then a clipped tone that didn't sound like the child I had raised. That call replayed in my memory years later when I realized it wasn't disappointment they felt. It was entitlement. I had nurtured responsibility in them when they were young, but somewhere along the way, responsibility sagged and expectation grew in its place. In the courtroom now, the judge asked whether counsel needed clarification before continuing. My attorney shook his head. Across the aisle, my children's lawyer shuffled papers, preparing a narrative shaped to favor them. I could see their posture, upright, rehearsed, impatient. They believed their story more than they believed mine. Or perhaps they simply believed possession was a right they had earned by existing. My heart didn't tighten, as it once might have. I let a soft breath pass through me, steady and unbroken. The truth was simple. I had spent years holding that household together with care and effort they never fully saw. They thought possessions were just things, but they had never understood the cost of keeping those things alive. A home is built not only from walls and loans, but from resilience. Late-night balancing of bills, quiet sacrifices that never made their way into stories. As the bailiff finally lifted the first page to resume reading, I felt a softness return to me, almost like a reminder from another life, I belonged to myself long before any of this began. That knowledge didn't make the situation painless, but it made it survivable. I straightened slightly, absorbing the room's tension without letting it settle inside me. Whatever history they would paint next, whatever claims they would make, the truth of my own effort lived in me like a warm pulse, and I intended to let that truth lead the rest of the way. The bailiff's words slowed, each one landing with the careful weight of stones placed across a river. I listened without interrupting, my expression still, though inside me old moments tugged at the edges of my composure. The judge asked a brief question about the timeline, and while the attorneys clarified dates, my thoughts drifted back to the evening when everything at home had begun to tilt in a way I could no longer ignore. It had been just after sunset, the sky a muted violet that pressed softly against the windows. I was setting aside folded laundry. Nothing remarkable, only the steady rhythm of a life I once considered ordinary. One of my children arrived unannounced, stepping inside with the quick, purposeful energy of someone carrying an agenda. Their greeting was polite, but thin, the kind of politeness that doesn't reach the eyes. I had felt the shift immediately, though I pretended not to. They stood in my living room, hands in pockets, surveying the furniture as if evaluating a space no longer belonging to me. They asked how I was doing, yet before I could answer fully, the conversation bent toward my possessions, my house, my car, my savings, presented under the guise of concern. They spoke about simplifying my life, about making things easier, though the words felt rehearsed. I brewed tea to steady myself and offered them a cup, but they declined, pacing lightly, brushing fingertips along a shelf they used to reach with wobbling hands. When they finally sat, it wasn't beside me. It was across from me, leaning forward, elbows on knees, tone too calm for what followed. They said the family had been talking and believed it was time to secure my future, to manage my assets more responsibly. My assets. The phrase lodged in my chest like cold metal. I answered gently, asking what prompted the sudden concern. They explained that they'd noticed small things, bills on the counter, a late payment on a repair, moments I looked tired. They attributed it to decline, though it was nothing more than the natural weight of living. I remembered inhaling slowly, choosing my words with care. I thanked them for worrying, but told them I wasn't in need of intervention. My voice remained warm, but theirs cooled. They insisted I reconsider. They said complications could arise later, and that decisions made now could prevent trouble. The conversation edged into territory I had hoped we'd never reach. When I declined again, something tightened in their jaw, and they rose from the sofa with a briskness that startled even them. They didn't slam the door when they left. That kind of anger would have been easier to understand. Instead, they gave a short nod and disappeared into the night, offering no embrace, no familiar warmth. I stood there for a long time, tea cooling in my hands, the steam fading as quietly as trust. Now, in the courtroom, that memory echoed through me as the attorneys debated the context surrounding the case. My children sat across from me, all polished composure and straight shoulders, but I could still see that moment, the faint disappointment, the subtle calculation, the way love had begun to fold under the weight of expectation. My attorney placed a document before me, tapping lightly to indicate where I might need to sign later. He whispered a reminder to stay calm, that our clarity mattered more than their performance. I nodded, grateful for the steadiness beside me. The judge called for a brief pause before the bailiff resumed, and during that silence, I felt a strange peace settle over me. That confrontation in my living room, so small, so contained, had been more than a warning. It had been the beginning of the truth revealing itself, one thread at a time. And though I hadn't known it then, it had prepared me for this moment, for this room, for this battle waged not with anger, but with presence. The judge signaled for the reading to continue. I straightened, eyes soft, posture unbroken. Whatever came next, I had already survived the moment that hurt most. The night I realized my children looked at my life not with gratitude, but with acquisition. And still, I chose to sit here with dignity. The bailiff cleared his throat, preparing to read the next portion of the record, but the judge paused him with a raised hand. She wanted clarification from both sides about when the conflict had escalated from private concern to open legal action. Her tone was even, not unkind, but firm enough to make the room shift slightly in its seats. My children's lawyer rose first, speaking with a polished certainty that felt strangely fragile, as though the words had been polished more than the truth behind them. While they debated their version of events, I drifted inward again, returning to the moment when everything at home crossed from uncomfortable tension into something unmistakably dangerous to the peace of my own life. It happened on a weekend morning, one that should have been soft and ordinary. The sun had risen gently, casting long lines of gold across my kitchen floor. I stood at the stove cooking eggs, enjoying the simple steadiness of the pan in my hand. I heard a car door slam outside, too loud, too abrupt, and before I could step toward the window, 2 of my children let themselves in without knocking. They didn't come with greetings, they came with urgency. They walked straight into the kitchen, their expressions set in a way that made me grip the edge of the counter. One of them spoke first, asking me if I had given thought to the proposal they had brought up. Proposal, what a tidy word for something that had felt more like pressure. I kept my back straight, my voice gentle, and told them I needed time. They exchanged glances that said time had already run out. They began pointing out things in the house, repairs they believed I was ignoring, belongings they felt were too much responsibility, decisions they believed I no longer had the energy to handle. Their tone wasn't harsh, but it was certain, and certainty can cut deeper than cruelty. I set the spatula down, turned off the stove, and folded my hands in front of me to keep them still. I asked them to sit, to breathe, to speak to me not as judges, but as my children. But they remained standing. One accusation slipped out, then another and another, until the kitchen, the place that had once held birthday candles and after-school chatter, felt crowded with something sharp and airless. When I said no, calmly, firmly, without anger, the room went quiet in a way I still remember. It wasn't the silence of understanding. It was the silence of a decision being made without me. One of them finally said they couldn't watch me lose control of my life. I wanted to tell them that control wasn't the issue, that I was tired, yes, but not incapable, that I needed partnership, not pressure. But before I could gather the words, they were already stepping back, already forming a plan between themselves. The door closed softly when they left. Not a slam. Softer things can hurt more. A few days later, the papers arrived. Now, seated in this courtroom, I felt the echo of that morning settle inside me without bitterness. I wasn't reliving it to reopen the wound. I was remembering it to understand the pattern, how the boundaries blurred, how concern became entitlement, how love twisted into something unrecognizable. My attorney leaned slightly toward me, his voice a quiet thread. This part of the timeline works in our favor. It shows pressure, not incapacity. I met his eyes and offered a small nod. The truth had its own weight, and today it was finally heavy in the right direction. Across the aisle, my children sat upright, their faces carefully composed. But beneath the composure, I sensed something flickering. Maybe doubt, maybe fear, maybe the first awareness that their version of events no longer held the shape they intended. The judge gestured for the bailiff to continue. He lifted the next page, his voice steady, and the words began to unfurl again through the silent room. As I listened, I felt a quiet certainty settle beneath my ribs. The turning point at home had not been the moment they pressured me. It had been the moment I did not break. The bailiff's voice settled into a steady rhythm, the kind that filled the room without raising its volume. He was outlining the period between the morning my children confronted me in my kitchen and the moment their petition reached the court. Dates, filings, certified letters, details that sounded dry on paper but carried the quiet ache of a betrayal that had unfolded inch by inch. While he read, the judge took notes with a calm, deliberate hand, nodding occasionally, her expression neither warm nor cold. Just present. Present enough to see what needed seeing. My attorney leaned back slightly, confident in a way that didn't need to announce itself. He had told me from the beginning that evidence often matters less than patterns, and patterns matter most when they reveal themselves without force. I kept that thought close as I listened. Every line of the record displayed not only what my children claimed about me, but the shape of their choices, the urgency they had manufactured, the way they had framed my independence as instability. My eyes drifted down to my hands again, resting quietly in my lap. The lighting in the courtroom softened around them, and for a moment I saw not the present, but the evening when I first began gathering documents, proof of responsibilities I had handled alone for years, proof of a life far steadier than the version they intended to present here. It had been late, the house dim, except for the lamp on my dining table. I had laid out bank statements, tax forms, repair invoices, handwritten reminders tucked inside old folders. The table looked like a landscape of a life accounted for, piece by piece. I remembered the small tremor in my fingers as I started sorting them, not from fear, but from the weight of finally facing the truth. I had raised children who no longer believed in my competence. That realization didn't break me. It clarified me. I had gone through each paper one at a time, smoothing edges, matching dates, making copies with a deliberate calm that surprised even me. The quiet that night was almost tender. I remember looking at the window and seeing the faint reflection of my face, tired, yes, but composed. There was strength in that reflection, strength that had been there all along, tucked beneath the weariness of being needed too much and understood too little. Back in the courtroom, the attorney for my children shifted uncomfortably as the bailiff emphasized a section noting that I had continued paying every bill, every mortgage installment, every insurance premium without lapse. The judge lifted her eyes briefly, and though she said nothing, the pause was meaningful. My children avoided looking in my direction. Their posture remained firm, but their breathing changed, shallow, clipped, the way people breathe when the narrative they've held on to begins to loosen. My attorney spoke gently when permitted, explaining the consistency of my responsibilities, the stability of my choices, the absence of any evidence supporting their claims. His tone wasn't combative. It was factual, the kind of truth delivered without ornament. Across the aisle, their lawyer pushed back, but even his arguments struggled for footing. And as I listened to both sides, something inside me softened, not toward them, but toward myself. For years I had blamed my own silence, my tendency to take on too much, to forgive too quickly, to hold our family together with both hands even when they pulled away. But now, hearing the facts laid bare, I understood something simple and powerful. I had been carrying more than anyone realized, and I had carried it well. The judge asked if I wished to clarify anything before they moved on. I didn't stand. I didn't adjust my posture. I simply spoke, my voice steady and warm. I said that I had always handled my responsibilities with care, that independence was not new to me, and that while age can change many things, it had not taken my clarity or capability. The words were soft, but the silence afterward told me they had landed where they needed to. The judge nodded once, slowly, and signaled for the proceedings to continue. Inside me, a quiet realization settled. This wasn't just a legal fight. It was the first time in a long time that I had allowed the truth of my own strength to speak without apology. The judge shifted slightly in her chair, signaling the bailiff to pause while she reviewed a note passed from the clerk. The rustle of paper was soft, but it drew the room's attention inward, as though everyone sensed the next portion would tilt the balance in some new direction. My attorney leaned forward, ready, while I remained still, my hands resting one atop the other, palms warm against the polished wood of the table. I had learned that the quietest posture often held the most strength. When the judge finally nodded, the bailiff resumed reading, this time moving into the portion of the record that described the formal steps my children had taken to challenge my competence and claim authority over my property. Hearing it aloud felt different from reading it on paper. Spoken, the accusations felt heavier, more deliberate, more revealing of their intention. Yet, even as the words filled the courtroom, something in me remained steady. I wasn't absorbing their claims anymore. I was observing them, and that distinction changed everything. My attorney spoke when prompted, pointing out inconsistencies not with harshness, but with precision. He explained how each claim had been made without supporting documentation, how assumptions had been treated as evidence, how urgency had been manufactured without basis. I watched the judge follow along, her eyes narrowing slightly, not in suspicion toward me, but toward the pattern now emerging from the record. It was in that moment that I understood the shift fully. The story my children had tried to construct was beginning to unravel under its own weight. My gaze drifted again, not away from the moment, but deeper into the memory that had taught me what I needed to see all along, the night I had discovered the pattern behind their pressure. I had been reviewing insurance statements, preparing them for my attorney, when a detail caught my eye. A series of messages between two of my children, forwarded inadvertently through a shared account. The messages weren't cruel. They weren't even particularly emotional. They were strategic. They discussed my belongings as assets. They outlined potential outcomes. They worried not about my well-being, but about timing, about losing the chance to secure what they believed would one day be theirs. I sat with those messages for a long time, the screen casting a pale glow across my living room. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet, streetlights steady against the night. Inside, something in me clicked into place. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even sorrow. It was recognition, a realization that what I was facing had little to do with concern and everything to do with control. That night, I closed the laptop gently, not with defeat, but with clarity. I understood then that love had not failed me. It had simply reached its limit with people who no longer knew how to return it in its original form. That understanding now followed me back to the present moment as the bailiff continued reading. My children avoided my gaze, but I saw the tension in their shoulders, the way their lawyer scribbled notes more quickly than before. Something in their foundation was shifting. My attorney asked the court to acknowledge the timeline of pressure leading to the petition, the unannounced visits, the unsolicited evaluations, the unsolicited plans made on my behalf. His tone was gentle but firm, the kind of firmness that doesn't need volume to be undeniable. The judge listened carefully, one hand resting near her pen, the other supporting her chin. She asked a few pointed questions. My children's lawyer hesitated before answering. In that hesitation, I felt the room change. When the judge thanked the bailiff and indicated she was ready to proceed to the next segment, I let my breath settle. I felt no triumph, just an anchored truth inside me, clear and solid. This wasn't about winning control. It was about reclaiming the meaning of my own life. As the judge prepared to move forward, I sat quietly, my posture steady, my heart calm. I had discovered the pattern long before this day, and now the court was beginning to see it too. The courtroom had grown so still that even the soft scrape of a chair seemed loud. The judge signaled for the next portion of the record, and the bailiff lifted a new stack of pages, ready to continue. But before he spoke, I felt a shift inside myself, quiet but unmistakable. We were entering the part of the case that touched directly on the evidence I had gathered. The nights I had sat alone at my dining table sorting through the fragments of my own life with more care than anyone else ever had. This was the moment when my preparation, patient and steady, would begin to matter. The bailiff began describing the documents I had submitted: receipts, statements, notarized copies of maintenance requests, and even photographs of items my children had claimed were neglected or mishandled. Each line brought a faint warmth to my chest, not pride, but confirmation. I had walked into this courtroom with nothing dramatic, nothing flashy, just the quiet truth of my own diligence. And now that truth was unfolding aloud, unembellished and undeniable. My attorney leaned closer, speaking softly. "This is where your consistency speaks for you. Let it." I nodded without looking away from the judge. Consistency had always been my strength. Years of keeping a home intact, years of stretching a paycheck with steady hands, years of doing the kind of work nobody applauds, but everyone depends on. It felt fitting that the very habit of holding things together would now help hold my life in place. As the bailiff continued, my thoughts drifted to the evening when I had taken photographs of certain possessions, objects my children insisted I hadn't maintained, objects they believed were evidence of decline. I remembered the way the lamp's light had fallen across a worn tabletop, the patina on a wooden frame, the gentle shadow cast by a vase I'd kept since my early days in the country. I hadn't photographed them to prove worth. I had photographed them to honor the care I'd given them. Every imperfection held a story, and every story held years of effort that none of my children had witnessed closely enough to understand. That night, as I moved through my home with the camera on my phone, I felt a strange calm washing over me. I wasn't documenting possessions. I was documenting continuity, evidence that I had tended to my life with quiet steadiness long after my children had drifted from its center. Nothing dramatic unfolded. No tears, no anger. Just me walking from room to room, capturing the truth gently, as though placing each moment into a small, protective envelope. Back in the courtroom now, the judge examined one of the photographs, raising her eyebrows slightly. Not in surprise, more in acknowledgement. My children shifted in their seats, clearly recognizing the image too. They tried to mask their discomfort, but I saw the flicker around their eyes, an unspoken realization that their narrative was beginning to fray at its edges. Their lawyer attempted to frame the evidence as selective, but my attorney countered with a quiet precision that left little room for argument. He explained how each image, each receipt, each maintenance record represented not a curated moment, but a consistent pattern. A pattern of responsible stewardship. A pattern of clarity. A pattern that contradicted every assumption they had relied on to bring me here. The judge listened intently, tapping her pen once against the file. A small gesture, but one that told me she was drawing a line in her mind between claims made and truth revealed. The bailiff moved to the next section, this one describing the timeline of my preparations, the completeness of the documents, the absence of any evidence suggesting mismanagement. His voice remained steady, but I could sense the room tightening around my children. Their posture stiffened. Their eyes darted toward one another, searching for reassurance that no longer fit the moment. I breathed slowly, letting air settle deep in my chest. For the first time since the case began, I felt something shift around me, a kind of recognition not from my children, but from the process itself. A quiet understanding that I had not come here defensively. I had come here truthfully, and truth, when spoken plainly, doesn't need to raise its voice. As the bailiff finished the page, the judge lifted her gaze to me, not examining, not questioning, simply seeing. I met her eyes with calm steadiness, offering no anger, no triumph, only clarity. What I had gathered in silence was beginning to speak for me. The bailiff turned to the next page, but before he began reading, the judge asked both attorneys to step forward. Their quiet conversation at the bench was too low to decipher, but the tone carried a different weight, careful, attentive, almost sharpened by something newly revealed. I watched from my seat, still and composed, while my children shifted beside their lawyer, whispering urgently. I didn't look directly at them. I kept my gaze softly fixed on the judge's expression instead, letting the room's shifting energy settle around me like a slow-moving tide. When the attorneys returned to their tables, the judge nodded for the bailiff to proceed. His next words marked a turn in the case, the discovery that had strengthened my position more than anything else. He read aloud about a clause buried deep in a financial document, one my attorney had found late one evening, hours after I had gone home from his office. It was a protective clause created years ago, back when my life was still full of long-term plans and cautious optimism. The clause guaranteed my right to retain full control of my assets as long as I continued meeting certain basic responsibilities. Responsibilities I had never once failed to meet. The courtroom felt different instantly. The air tightened, but not with tension, more with realization. My children's lawyer straightened abruptly, clearly recognizing the shift. My children themselves froze, their expressions flickering through disbelief, irritation, and something that bordered on fear. They had built their case on the assumption that my stability was slipping, but the clause made one thing unmistakably clear. The law had been protecting me long before they had tried to take anything away. My attorney spoke with calm precision, outlining how the clause nullified several aspects of their petition. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The truth, once uncovered, had its own volume. Across the aisle, their lawyer tried to argue timing, interpretation, intent, but the words lacked weight. The judge followed along carefully, her posture no longer neutral but engaged. While the arguments unfolded, my mind drifted to the night my attorney had called me about the clause. I had been sitting on my front porch, wrapped in a shawl, the sound of distant traffic humming through the darkness. He had spoken with a rare note of relief in his voice, telling me he had found something important. When he explained it, I closed my eyes and breathed deeply, letting the wind brush against my face. Not because I felt victorious, victory was too small a word, but because I felt seen, protected, anchored by something that stood quietly on my side long before anyone tried to challenge it. That memory dissolved back into the present as the bailiff continued reading. The judge asked my children's attorney to clarify why the clause had not been acknowledged in their filings. His answer came out thin, rushed, strained. Even he could hear it. Even he understood what it meant. One of my children finally spoke up, asking permission to address the judge directly. Their voice trembled beneath a veneer of practiced calm. They insisted they had acted out of concern. The judge listened politely, but her expression didn't mirror their urgency. She wasn't cold. She was simply unmoved by emotion that contradicted fact. My attorney leaned toward me, just slightly, and whispered, "This is the moment the tide shifts. You don't need to do anything. Just hold your ground." So I did, not with force, not with pride, with quiet, steady dignity. The bailiff read the final lines of the section, confirming what the clause established, that unless clear evidence of incapacity existed, and none did, my autonomy was not only intact, but legally reinforced. The judge nodded slowly, allowing the significance to settle in the room. Across from me, my children sat in a silence that felt heavier than anger, heavier than disappointment. It was the weight of a plan beginning to dissolve. I rested my hands gently together, the same way I used to fold them while waiting for bread to rise in my old kitchen. Calm, patient, grounded in something deeper than fear. The truth had spoken, and I had not needed to raise my voice for it to be heard. The courtroom felt tighter now, as though the very walls understood what had just shifted. My children sat frozen, their expressions carefully arranged, but unable to hide the thin strain at the edges. Their lawyer leaned toward them, whispering something meant to reassure, but reassurance has a sound, and whatever he said did not carry it. My attorney, on the other hand, settled back in his chair with a quiet confidence that didn't need to be displayed. He simply adjusted a page, smoothed a corner, and waited. I matched his composure, letting my breath fall into a slow, even rhythm. The judge instructed the bailiff to continue, and his voice resumed, steady, clear, almost gentler than before. He was now reading the section, documenting communications exchanged between my children during the months leading up to the petition. Not the private messages I had seen by accident, but the ones submitted as evidence by their own attorney. It was astonishing how much truth can reveal itself when people believe they are untouchable. The messages began benignly, worry framed as practicality, suggestions cloaked as kindness. But as the months passed, the tone shifted. Their words grew shorter, sharper, threaded with frustration. The bailiff read a line aloud. "She won't take the hint." Hearing it repeated in that formal space made something inside me settle in its rightful place, like a stone long out of alignment finally finding a groove. Not because it hurt, but because it clarified. My children exchanged a nervous glance. One of them ran a thumb along the edge of the table, pressing so firmly I could see the knuckle whiten. Their lawyer attempted to object, but the judge lifted a hand before he formed the full sentence. She wanted the reading to continue uninterrupted. The next lines exposed subtle strategies. They had debated how best to present me, how to frame my decisions as poor judgment, how to highlight minor moments of fatigue as signs of something larger. I didn't flinch. The truth had stopped hurting me a long time ago. What hurt was understanding how little they had trusted me to know my own life. My attorney leaned in slightly. "Let the judge absorb it," he whispered. "She is seeing the pattern." I didn't answer. My stillness was enough. Then the bailiff read something that made the entire room pause. A message in which one of my children wrote that securing my assets early would prevent complications later. The phrasing echoed the same words from that evening in my living room. Hearing it in this room, spoken aloud before a judge, stripped it of the softness they had tried to use to mask it. It was no longer concern. It was intent. A low ripple of discomfort passed across their table. Their attorney tried again to object, but the judge shook her head, calm but firm. She asked the bailiff to finish the full set of communications. As he read, it became clear that their pressure had not been born from love. It had been born from fear. Not fear for me, but fear of losing control over a future they believed belonged to them. I watched my children as this truth unfolded, piece by piece. I did not gloat. I did not harden. I simply listened, anchored by the quiet understanding that none of them had expected me to stand so firmly in my own voice. When the reading ended, the judge asked if I wished to make any comment. I shook my head softly. There was nothing to add. The truth was complete without my embellishment. My attorney addressed the court instead, his tone measured. He explained that these messages reflected not neglect from my side, but coercion from theirs, a coordinated effort to define my autonomy according to their convenience. He spoke without malice, without heat, without dramatics. The calmness in his voice felt like a mirror to the calmness I carried inside myself. Across from us, my children sat in silence. Their expressions softened, not with remorse, not yet, but with the dawning awareness that the story they had built was not holding, not under scrutiny, not under truth. The judge took a long moment before speaking. Her gaze traveled from their table to mine, lingering on me with a quiet, assessing empathy. She asked the bailiff to prepare the next section. I straightened slightly, not from tension, but from readiness. Their instability had begun to show, thread by thread, and I did not need to tear anything down. I simply needed to remain standing. The judge thanked the bailiff and requested that both attorneys prepare for the next evidentiary segment. A soft murmur traveled through the courtroom as papers shifted and chairs adjusted, but beneath it all, there was a new, unmistakable tone: expectation. Something had turned in the room. Even the quiet seemed poised, waiting for the next breath, the next truth. My attorney leaned toward me with a subtle nod, the kind that doesn't call attention but carries reassurance. This next phase, he had told me earlier, would focus on my preparation for the hearing, my steadiness, my clarity, my intentionality. In other words, the part of the story that revealed not who my children believed I was, but who I had always been. When the bailiff resumed reading, his voice carried that shift. He detailed the timeline leading up to the hearing, meetings I attended promptly, documents I organized with precision, evaluations I completed willingly and without hesitation. Each line painted a portrait in quiet strokes, showing a woman who did not fear scrutiny because she had lived honestly, a woman who had nothing to hide. Across the aisle, my children sat rigid. They exchanged glances filled with discomfort, questions they didn't dare voice in front of the judge. Their lawyer's pen flicked nervously against his notes, a small, rapid movement that revealed more truth than any argument he might give. I breathed slowly, letting the memory of those preparation days rise gently within me. I thought of the morning I had sat at my kitchen table, sunlight spilling across a stack of manila folders. I brewed coffee and arranged everything in a neat row: bank statements, property records, medical receipts, even old photographs I no longer remembered taking. There was no panic in that process, just patience, just care. Just the quiet insistence that I would not allow anyone else to define my story for me. I remembered the feel of the pen in my hand as I labeled each folder with steady block letters, the weight of the paper, the warmth of the mug near my elbow, the steadiness of my breath. Preparing for the hearing had not broken me. It had rebuilt something inside me, a sense of agency that had slipped away slowly over the years, more through habit than force. In the courtroom now, my attorney stood. His voice remained soft, almost conversational. He explained how I had approached every evaluation with openness, how I had completed each task without delay, how I had demonstrated not only capability, but discernment. He spoke of my routines, how I managed my home, my responsibilities, my decisions. Not with flair, with consistency. The judge listened intently. My children's attorney attempted to counter, but the judge stopped him gently, reminding him that capability is measured not by fear imposed on someone, but by the clarity with which they navigate their own life. My children looked down. The bailiff continued reading, now moving into the portion describing my demeanor during meetings. Respectful, punctual, prepared. Nothing extravagant. Nothing one could argue against. Just the calm reality of someone who had been underestimated for far too long. And then came the part that caught my breath. Not because it hurt, but because it affirmed something I hadn't known anyone had noticed. It stated that I conducted myself with dignity at every step. That word, dignity, echoed through the small, silent room as though someone had said it gently in my hands. I felt its weight. I felt its truth. My attorney glanced at me, a small, knowing expression softening his features. I offered a quiet nod in return. Across the aisle, my children shifted again. Their expressions softened, but not in apology, more in the dawning discomfort of realizing the ground beneath them had not been soil, but sand. The judge asked if I wished to speak. I rose slowly, smoothing my skirt with one hand. When I looked up, I kept my voice warm, steady. I said I had prepared for this case, not out of anger, but out of respect, for the court, for the truth, and for myself. I said I believed clarity was a kindness, and that I hoped, whatever the outcome, understanding would replace assumption. The courtroom held its breath around my words. When I sat down, the judge regarded me with a quiet, thoughtful expression. She nodded once, then signaled for the bailiff to prepare the next portion. Inside me, something grounded itself more deeply. I had prepared for this battle with dignity. Now the court could see it. The courtroom door closed softly behind the last person who'd stepped back in, and for a moment the room settled into a hush so complete it almost felt deliberate. The judge adjusted her glasses, folding her hands lightly on the bench, and nodded for the bailiff to continue. But this time, the reading would cover the part everyone had been bracing for, the confrontation itself. Not loud, not explosive, just the truth meeting the people who had tried so hard to outrun it. My attorney leaned closer, whispering that this section would show the emotional core of the case, the intentions behind my children's decisions, the posture they carried into conflict, the tone they used when asked to explain their actions. He told me I didn't need to speak unless the judge asked. I nodded once, settling deeper into my seat, letting the steadiness I'd cultivated over these long weeks gather around me like fabric I had sewn myself. The bailiff began reading testimony, statements my children had given in earlier meetings, words spoken with what had sounded like confidence at the time. But confidence shifts when held up against clarity. Their statements revealed contradictions, small fractures in their narrative. They claimed they only wanted to help me, yet admitted they had discussed distributing certain belongings. They said they acted out of fear for my future, yet acknowledged they had not asked me directly how I wanted to be supported. The judge listened without interrupting. I watched my children's faces as their own words were repeated back to them. Not with triumph, not with bitterness, simply with the quiet awareness that truth has a way of returning to its source. My thoughts drifted back to the first meeting where my attorney and I sat across from them at a long wooden table, the air thick with tension that no one wanted to name. They had arrived as a united front, their lawyer beside them, folders neatly stacked, expressions guarded. I had walked in alone before my attorney joined me, and I remembered their surprise when I took my seat without shrinking. They had spoken first. Their voices didn't crack, but they trembled around the edges in ways they likely didn't hear. They explained their concerns, painting pictures of imagined decline, of assumptions wrapped in worry. I listened with my hands folded lightly, not defending, not interrupting. At one point, the eldest leaned forward and said, "We just want what's best for you." I remembered how the sentence landed, not tender, but rehearsed. When my attorney asked them what exactly I had failed to manage, they hesitated. It was a small hesitation, but it shifted the room. They exchanged glances, each waiting for the other to answer. And in that pause, I recognized something that I carried with me into the courtroom today. They were not driven by malice. They were driven by fear. Fear that their lives would become more complicated if mine stayed in my own hands. Back in the present, the bailiff continued, reading their conflicting statements about their motivations. One message suggested urgency, another suggested opportunity, another tried to soften both. Their lawyer attempted to intervene, but the judge raised a calm hand, requesting that all statements be read in full. My children looked smaller now, not because the judge had diminished them, but because the truth had. They were unraveling under the weight of their own reasoning. My attorney stood, addressing the judge with deliberate restraint. He explained that concern, when genuine, invites conversation, not coercion. That love, when steady, doesn't strategize. He did not accuse my children of cruelty. He didn't need to. He simply held up the mirror of their actions and let the reflection speak for itself. The judge then turned her attention to me. She asked if I had anything I wished to say regarding my children's intentions. I rose slowly, smoothing my skirt, and allowed a breath to settle before I spoke. I told her I believed love had once lived strongly between us, and that I did not doubt my children wanted security, perhaps even for me in their own way. But I said love cannot justify taking someone's voice away. I said I hoped in time they would understand that boundaries are not rejection. They are respect. The courtroom felt impossibly still. I returned to my seat, never looking at my children directly because I knew my words were not meant to wound. They were meant to land gently, even if gently felt heavy today. The judge inhaled softly, her eyes lowered to her notes. Something in her posture told me she had heard more than arguments. She had heard truth. The bailiff prepared the next page. Inside me, a calm certainty settled. The confrontation had already happened long before this day, quietly, painfully, in rooms where dignity became my only shield. Now, the world simply had the chance to witness it. The bailiff lifted the next stack of papers with a measured care, and even that small sound, the gentle shift of pages, seemed to echo across the room. Everyone knew this was where the case edged into its turning point. The judge leaned slightly forward, elbows resting on the bench in a posture that carried neither impatience nor sympathy, only readiness. My attorney exhaled quietly, and I felt the weight of the moment settle against my sternum like a warm hand, steadying rather than pressing. This was the section where the list would finally be addressed. But before the bailiff reached that part, the record shifted to the immediate minutes preceding its reading. The tense exchanges, the whispered strategizing, the subtle unraveling of my children's unity. As he read, I watched their faces from the corner of my eye. They tried to sit tall, but something in their posture had collapsed inward. A child might slump from tiredness. An adult slumps from realization. The bailiff continued, describing their rising agitation, questions they asked their lawyer, speculations spoken too quickly, frustrations muttered when they believed no one was listening. Not insults, not anger. Something quieter. Something that sounded like fear meeting consequence. My children were beginning to understand they had miscalculated not just the law, but me. We shifted then into the hallway moment, after a short recess when they had gathered outside the courtroom. The record noted their disagreement with each other, their worry that the case was no longer leaning in their favor. Their words were paraphrased, softened by legal phrasing, but the shape of them remained unmistakable. They were not discussing my well-being. They were discussing outcomes. My attorney glanced at me, but I kept my gaze steady on the judge. I didn't need to look at my children to feel the truth of the moment. Distance does not require sight. The bailiff took a slow breath before turning to the page that documented their return to the courtroom. Faces tight, voices clipped, the unified front they had once shown now thin as tissue. It described how they avoided looking at me, how one had trembled slightly when placing a document before their lawyer, how another had pressed their lips together until they whitened. I remembered that moment with absolute clarity. They had believed I would walk into that room diminished. Instead, I walked back in grounded. Finally, the bailiff reached the section that led directly to the unveiling of the list. The record described how my children had insisted the list would prove I had mishandled my possessions, that I had neglected items of value, that I had forgotten their locations or mismanaged their upkeep. Their lawyer had spoken with rehearsed certainty, gesturing toward the envelope as if it were the final stone needed to build their case. But the record also noted something else. My response. I had not argued. I had not rushed to defend myself. I had only placed my hands together, palms warm, and offered a small nod, an acknowledgement not of defeat, but of readiness. The judge had looked at me then, just briefly, as though trying to understand where such quiet steadiness came from. In the courtroom now, I could feel the same question rising again. Not from the judge, not from my attorney, but from my children. How is she still calm? The bailiff reached the line that would lead into the reading of the list, but paused, awaiting the judge's signal. She didn't give it yet. Instead, she asked both legal teams whether they wished to add context before the list was read. My attorney declined gently. Our truth required no embellishment. Their lawyer hesitated. It was a hesitation that carried weight, the weight of someone realizing the ground beneath them was no longer solid, the weight of someone searching for control they could no longer grasp. He eventually said no as well. The record closed on this moment, the bailiff standing poised with the envelope, my children holding their breath, the courtroom suspended in a silence that felt almost sacred, and me seated with a calm that no one could explain but me. Inside, I whispered the same truth that had carried me through every hardship long before this courtroom existed. Dignity does not raise its voice. It stands. The bailiff held the envelope as if it were something fragile, something that required both hands and a steady breath. The judge gave a small nod, and the room shifted, not physically, but emotionally, like a tide pulling back before it returns with quiet force. My attorney straightened his papers without looking down at them. He was already prepared. My children sat rigid, their anticipation sharp enough to cut through the air between us. This was the moment everything would turn, not with spectacle, with truth. The bailiff broke the seal. The sound was soft, barely more than a sigh, but it rippled through the courtroom with startling clarity. He slid out the pages, lifted the first one, and began to read the list my children had demanded, item by item, possession by possession, each one something they believed they could use against me. But the tone of his reading shifted almost immediately, because the list told a story none of them expected. The first items were practical: household valuables, heirlooms, repairs completed, accounts maintained, everything documented, everything up to date. My children exchanged uneasy glances. Their lawyer tried to hide his surprise behind a still expression, but stillness is not the same as composure. Then the list deepened. It detailed maintenance logs for items they had claimed were neglected. Every date, every receipt, every completed check. I watched the color drain from their faces as the truth unfolded one meticulous line at a time. The judge leaned forward, interest sharpening. The room felt smaller suddenly, as if every wall had moved in to witness the shift taking place. My children's hands tightened against their table. One swallowed hard. Another looked down, blinking rapidly, as though trying to understand how the narrative had slipped so far from their grasp. But the list wasn't finished. The bailiff continued reading, his voice steady, almost gentle, but the weight of each entry fell like a soft hammer. It revealed gifts I had saved for them, things I had kept in storage, cleaned and repaired over the years, waiting for the right occasion. Items they had forgotten entirely, items they didn't know I had protected. The judge looked at them then, not at the papers, not at the attorneys, but at my children. Her expression carried no judgment, only clarity. The list spoke louder than any argument ever could. The bailiff turned another page. Now came the unexpected portion, the part neither side had anticipated because it wasn't evidence offered by the lawyers. It was something the court itself had requested, an independent inventory taken by a neutral evaluator, and it confirmed everything, every possession accounted for, every responsibility fulfilled, every task completed, not just adequately, but with care, not extravagance, not negligence, care. My attorney breathed out slowly. My children's lawyer no longer tried to hide his unease. The judge's posture softened, not toward me, but toward the truth itself. Then the final line of the evaluator's report was read aloud. She demonstrates consistent responsibility, organization, and clarity of mind. No concerns noted. The silence that followed was unlike any other moment that day. My children looked stunned, not angry, not defiant, stunned, as though they were seeing me for the first time in years, not as a problem to fix or a burden to manage, but as a woman who had been carrying her life with quiet competence long after they stopped noticing. I didn't look at them directly. I didn't need to. Pain has its own weight, but so does truth. The bailiff lowered the papers. The judge exhaled softly, then turned to me. "Thank you for your patience," she said. Simple words, but spoken with the steadiness of someone who understood what patience costs. My attorney rested a hand lightly on the table beside me, not touching me, just grounding the moment. The judge then addressed my children. Her tone remained professional, but it carried something new: consequence. "This list," she said, "does not support your petition." There was no anger in her voice, only finality. My children blinked, as though waking from a dream they had built together, a dream that had unraveled strand by strand until only the truth remained. I let my shoulders lower, not in relief, but in quiet acceptance. The list they believed would undo me had revealed instead the life I had held intact with steady hands. The judge's words lingered in the air long after her voice fell silent. Not harsh, not triumphant, just final. A quiet closing of a door my children had tried so desperately to force open. The courtroom didn't erupt or shift dramatically. Instead, it settled, like dust after a long storm, like breath finally released after being held too long. My attorney folded his notes with patient precision, and I rested my palms softly on the table, feeling the wood warm beneath my skin. The judge asked both parties if they wished to make final statements before she issued her ruling. My children's lawyer rose, attempting a composed argument for reconsideration, but the tone was different now. Fragile. The judge listened respectfully but without being swayed. The truth had already aligned itself, and no amount of reshaping could undo what the list had revealed. Then she turned to me. I stood slowly, smoothing my skirt, letting my breath settle inside me like calm water. I did not speak of hurt. I did not speak of betrayal. I simply thanked the court for its careful attention and affirmed that my autonomy was not a weapon, but a responsibility I carried with honor. The judge nodded, her expression softening as though she recognized the quiet strength it took to stand there without bitterness. My attorney spoke next, brief and steady, emphasizing clarity over emotion. Then came my children's turn. They rose one by one. Their words were not coordinated this time. The first apologized without meeting my eyes, the second insisted misunderstanding, and the third spoke only a single trembling sentence about wanting to protect what they thought was slipping. None of them said they were wrong. None of them said they saw me, but something in their voices hinted at the beginning of a truth they hadn't yet found the courage to hold. The judge listened to each of them, then delivered her ruling with gentle firmness. The petition was dismissed entirely. My autonomy remained intact. No further claims could be made without substantial evidence, a threshold they could no longer pretend to reach. But she didn't end there. She addressed them directly, her voice steady and compassionate. "Autonomy," she said, "is not something you take from someone because you fear losing control. It is something you honor, especially when that person has demonstrated consistency and clarity. Her words were not a reprimand, they were a mirror. My children sat in silence, each absorbing the reflection differently. The gavel struck, soft, deliberate, and the case was closed. People began gathering their belongings. Lawyers whispered final instructions. Papers shuffled. But for a moment, I remained seated, grounded in a stillness that felt earned, not imposed. As I rose to leave, my children approached me, not together, not confidently. Just three individuals searching for footing. The eldest opened their mouth as if to speak, but the words didn't land. Another reached for a gesture that faltered halfway. The third simply looked at me, eyes damp, but holding something more complicated than regret. I didn't offer them anger. I didn't offer absolution. I simply nodded, one quiet acknowledgement that the story wasn't finished, even if this chapter was. Outside, the sun touched the courthouse steps with a gentle warmth. My attorney walked beside me for a few moments, then paused to shake my hand. "You carried yourself with dignity," he said. I smiled, not wide, not triumphant, just true. "I carried what was mine," I replied. As he walked away, I took a slow breath and let the air settle inside me. The courthouse doors closed behind me with a soft thud, and the world felt larger somehow, not because I had won, but because I had reclaimed a space within myself that had been threatened but never lost. The sky stretched open, quiet and bright. I stepped forward, not into victory, but into peace. I walked down the courthouse steps with the kind of quiet that settles not around you, but inside you, like dust after a long, heavy wind. The air felt different on my skin, lighter somehow, as though the world had finally stopped pressing against my ribs. I didn't rush. I didn't glance back. I let each step carry the weight of the day away from me, one breath at a time. For so long, I had imagined this moment coming with triumph or grief, some sharp edge to mark its importance. But it arrived instead with stillness. A stillness earned through weeks of holding my own truth carefully, like a fragile bowl filled to the brim. I had feared it might spill. It hadn't. At the bottom of the steps, I paused and let the sunlight warm the tops of my hands. They looked the same as always, familiar lines, familiar softness, but I understood them differently now. These hands had built a life, tended a home, carried responsibilities no one saw and no one thanked. These hands had held love. These hands had held silence. Today, they held freedom. Behind me, I heard the courthouse doors open. Footsteps followed, hesitant, uneven. I didn't turn, but I knew the sound of my children anywhere. For a moment, the air thickened with all the words we hadn't said, all the years we hadn't understood each other, all the love that had bent but not broken. They stopped a few steps behind me, waiting, not demanding, not accusing, just waiting. I let the silence breathe. Then, without looking back, I offered a small nod. A gesture not of reconciliation, but of possibility. The kind that says, "I am still here. We may yet find a way." If they answered, their words were too soft for the wind to carry. But the quiet between us no longer felt like a battleground. It felt like a beginning, not warm, not certain, but honest. I walked toward the street with a slower stride, noticing details I hadn't seen on the way in. The way the trees framed the courthouse like guardians, the way a single leaf skated across the pavement, the way the sun touched everything without choosing sides. I thought of the list, how it revealed not my failures, but my care, how it didn't save me, it simply told the truth I had lived for years. And I realized something I should have known long ago. Dignity isn't something you fight for. It's something you return to, like a home you forgot you built. As I reached the sidewalk, I inhaled deeply, letting the breath settle into the empty spaces where fear used to sit. The day wasn't triumphant. It didn't need to be. It was steady. It was clear. It was mine. That is the quiet victory no one can take. The world often teaches us that strength is loud, but I have learned, after children, after love, after courtrooms, that the strongest thing a person can be is calm in their own truth. Sometimes the gentlest stand is the one that holds the most weight. And sometimes dignity is not the way you walk away, but the way you stay yourself. Wherever you are reading this from, may you find the kind of peace that doesn't ask permission to exist. Where are you listening to me from today? Share your city. It moves me to see how far these stories travel. And if your heart still has room for one more quiet truth, follow the video that appears on your screen. Sometimes the next chapter finds us exactly when we're ready for it.